Early 2023, a suburban neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia, USA. Margaret Wilson lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Atlanta, surrounded by well-kept lawns and tree-lined streets. From the outside, her life appeared typical, married to Charles Wilson, a hard-working construction foreman, and living in a cozy two-story home. But behind closed doors, Margaret felt invisible and alone. At 38, Margaret struggled with her weight and self-esteem. She often avoided mirrors and dreaded public outings. Her husband, Charles, was always busy with work. Long hours at the construction site meant he was rarely home, and when he was often too tired to talk or spend quality time with her. Their once loving relationship had turned into a distant routine of short, polite conversations. To fill the emptiness, Margaret took up baking and reading romance novels, escaping into stories of love and excitement. She tried to reignite their spark by cooking special dinners or planning weekend trips, but Charles was usually too distracted or worn out to notice. Ethan Wilson, Charles's younger brother, frequently visited their home. At 35, Ethan was the opposite of Charles, charismatic, energetic, and fun. He worked as a freelance graphic designer, which gave him plenty of free time to stop by and chat. Ethan noticed the small details about Margaret, the new curtains she'd hung in the living room, her changing style, and the way her smile lit up the room. Unlike Charles, Ethan made Margaret feel important. He complimented her cooking, listened to her thoughts, and made her laugh. Slowly, Margaret began looking forward to Ethan's visits. She found herself dressing a little nicer when he came over, baking his favorite treats and enjoying their conversations. At first, Margaret convinced herself it was harmless. Ethan was just being friendly, and she was enjoying the attention. But deep down, she knew that her feelings for him were growing stronger. He made her feel alive, something she hadn't experienced in years. Charles, however, remained unaware of the growing bond between his wife and brother. To him, Ethan's visits were just a way for Margaret to pass the time while he worked long hours. But for Margaret, Ethan was becoming much more a source of comfort and excitement in her otherwise lonely life. Though she felt guilty, Margaret couldn't deny the thrill she felt when Ethan was around. She knew she was crossing a line, but the attention and affection he gave her were impossible to resist. As the weather warmed in spring 2023, the air seemed to carry a new energy for Margaret. The dull monotony of her life slowly began to shift as Ethan's visits became more frequent and meaningful. What began as casual conversations over coffee turned into something more, something Margaret could no longer ignore. Ethan, always attentive and thoughtful, began offering Margaret emotional support in ways Charles never had. He would listen patiently to her frustrations about her marriage, about the way Charles worked late or ignored her needs. He didn't judge her. Instead, he nodded sympathetically, offering kind words and a gentle touch on her shoulder. Margaret had never felt so seen. "You deserve more than this, Margaret," Ethan would say, his voice soft but full of sincerity. "You've got so much to offer, and anyone would be lucky to have you." Each compliment, each gentle word, built Margaret's self-esteem in ways she hadn't imagined possible. She began to look at herself differently, to see past the insecurities that had held her back for so long. For the first time in years, she felt beautiful, important, worth something more than just a wife who was ignored by her husband. They began bonding over their shared frustrations, their personal secrets. Margaret confided in Ethan about her feelings of neglect in her marriage, about her loneliness, and her struggle with her weight. Ethan listened intently, offering comfort, understanding, and reassurance. He spoke to her like a friend, like someone who truly understood her, and in return, she shared more than she ever had before. Ethan, too, began to open up, sharing stories of his own struggles. He spoke of his childhood, his own relationships, and the pressure he felt to be the fun brother while Charles was the responsible one. There was a depth to their conversations that Margaret hadn't experienced in years. She found herself looking forward to their talks, their moments of connection. Ethan made her feel alive, something Charles had stopped doing long ago. As their bond deepened, Margaret found herself seeking Ethan's attention more and more. Each time he left after one of their conversations, a feeling of emptiness would settle in her chest. She had come to depend on him not just for emotional support, but for a sense of validation she hadn't realized she'd been craving for so long. Her thoughts began to revolve around Ethan, even when he wasn't around. She'd replay his compliments in her mind, remembering how his eyes would linger on her, how he'd smile in a way that made her heart skip a beat. She found herself dressing up more on the days he was scheduled to visit, doing her makeup a little more carefully, hoping he would notice. She didn't just want his attention anymore. She wanted more. One evening, after an especially long and intimate conversation, Ethan leaned in closer, his hand brushing against hers. It was electric, the tension between them palpable, and Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to pull away, to stop it before it went too far, but something inside her urged her to stay. Ethan's presence, his nearness, felt too good, too comforting. "I can't keep pretending that I don't feel this way, Margaret," Ethan murmured, his voice low. "I care about you more than I should." Margaret's heart raced as she met his gaze. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. She had never imagined this moment would come, but deep down, she had known it was inevitable. There was no turning back now. In that moment, their relationship shifted from one of emotional support to something far more dangerous. Their lips met in a brief, stolen kiss, a kiss that sealed their fate. The spark that had started as a quiet ember was now an uncontrollable fire. As the days passed, their affair intensified. Margaret, now more confident and aware of her own desires, found herself seeking Ethan's company more than ever. And Ethan, equally captivated by Margaret's vulnerability and newfound beauty, continued to feed her emotional needs, making her feel cherished in ways Charles never had. The affair reached its peak when Charles left for a week-long business trip in mid-April. The house, usually filled with the distant echoes of Charles' absence, was now filled with anticipation. Ethan's visits became more frequent, their stolen moments more intense. The couple found themselves meeting in secret spots, whispering sweet nothings to each other, their stolen kisses growing longer and more passionate. Margaret was no longer just a lonely housewife. She was a woman who had tasted something forbidden, and she couldn't stop herself from wanting more. Every moment with Ethan made her feel alive in ways she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer invisible. She was desired, adored, and her dependency on Ethan's affection grew stronger with each passing day. But as their affair continued to intensify, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of her control. She knew that if Charles ever found out, everything would shatter her marriage, her family, and the fragile sense of self-worth that had been built on Ethan's attention. But for now, those concerns were buried under the waves of passion and excitement that her secret relationship with Ethan brought her. As the summer of 2023 approached, the tension in Margaret's life began to build. What had started as a secret, thrilling affair now felt like a dangerous game of cat and mouse. The passion and excitement that had fueled her relationship with Ethan were still there, but now cracks were beginning to form in the delicate web they had woven. Charles, oblivious to the specifics, started noticing small changes in Margaret's behavior. At first, it was the way she dressed. No longer content with her usual comfortable, loose-fitting clothes, Margaret had begun dressing more carefully, choosing outfits that were more flattering, more fashionable, perhaps even a little too flashy for the casual suburban life she led. Her hair, once pulled back in a messy bun, was now styled neatly, and she wore makeup more often. Charles couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a distinct difference in the way she carried herself. "Margaret, are you going somewhere special?" Charles asked one evening, eyeing her brightly colored blouse and neatly styled hair. Margaret, caught off guard by the question, smiled and shrugged. "Just felt like getting dressed up." "Why not?" she replied, trying to dismiss the concern. But Charles wasn't convinced. He watched his wife more closely over the following weeks, noticing that her once easygoing demeanor had changed. She seemed distracted, distant, her thoughts always somewhere else. When they spoke, Margaret would often zone out, her eyes glazing over as if she was lost in another world. Charles didn't know what was happening, but the small cracks in their relationship had begun to show. Meanwhile, Ethan, too, was feeling the strain of their secret affair. At first, he had been captivated by Margaret's attention, drawn to her in ways he couldn't explain. But as their relationship deepened, the guilt began to gnaw at him. He had always considered Margaret a friend, someone he cared for. But as the affair progressed, the weight of their actions started to weigh heavily on him. Ethan had a girlfriend, Sarah, someone he had been seeing for nearly 2 years. She was kind, supportive, and had no idea about his secret life with Margaret. The guilt of betraying Sarah, coupled with the growing pressure from Margaret to give up his girlfriend and commit to her, was becoming unbearable. Margaret's neediness was beginning to suffocate him, and the more he tried to distance himself, the more insistent and obsessive she became. "I can't keep doing this, Ethan," Margaret said one evening, her voice tense and demanding. "You need to choose me. If you don't leave Sarah, I'll tell Charles about us. I can't keep living like this, being your secret." Ethan's heart raced as he heard the ultimatum in Margaret's voice. He had never imagined that things would escalate this far. Margaret's obsession with him had grown to the point where she was now threatening to expose everything. He felt trapped between two worlds, his growing sense of responsibility towards Sarah and his undeniable connection to Margaret, which he had never been able to completely shake off. I don't know if I can just walk away from Sarah," Ethan admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. This is a mess, Margaret." Margaret's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "I've given you everything. I've trusted you. And you're gonna leave me for her." Her voice wavered with both frustration and desperation. "You need to make a choice. If you don't, I'll make sure Charles finds out. It's the only way I can see to get what I deserve." Ethan was taken aback by her words. He never imagined Margaret would go that far. The idea of her exposing their affair terrified him. He had seen firsthand how much her marriage with Charles had been strained, but he hadn't realized just how far Margaret would go to secure his attention. But as the summer wore on, the strain of the affair began to take its toll. Ethan, feeling suffocated and overwhelmed, began to pull away. At first, it was subtle, a missed call here. But eventually, the distance between them became undeniable. Margaret's desperation only seemed to grow, while Ethan, consumed with guilt and anxiety, became more distant and evasive. He started making excuses not to visit, telling Margaret he was busy with work or needed time to focus on his personal life. Each time, Margaret grew more frustrated, her heart sinking as she realized that Ethan was slipping away. The once deep emotional connection between them seemed to be fading, replaced by cold silence and unmet expectations. Ethan's avoidance made Margaret feel even more betrayed and abandoned. She no longer felt like the woman who had been cherished and desired. Instead, she felt like a shadow, someone who had been cast aside. She began to doubt everything, her emotions spiraling out of control. In an effort to regain control, Margaret tried to confront Ethan more directly. She showed up at his apartment unannounced, desperate to force him into a conversation. But when she arrived, she found Ethan was not alone. Sarah was there, her presence a sharp reminder of the life Ethan had outside of their affair. Margaret's jealousy flared, and she knew, deep down, that the situation was slipping beyond her control. "I can't keep doing this, Ethan," Margaret said coldly when she saw Sarah in the doorway. "You've made your choice." Ethan, caught between the two women, was silent. The tension was unbearable, and for the first time, he realized just how far things had gone and how much damage had been done. Margaret left that day with a broken heart and a mind full of rage. She was no longer the woman who had been quietly waiting's attention. She had changed, her obsession now fully consuming her. The emotional strain of the affair, the guilt, and the feeling of being betrayed had pushed her to a dangerous breaking point. And as Ethan continued to distance himself, Margaret's desperation grew. She would stop at nothing to make sure he would never leave her, even if it meant destroying everything in her path. As the fall of 2023 descended on the small town of Maplewood, Ohio, the tension between Margaret and Ethan reached a boiling point. Ethan, now struggling with his emotions and the guilt of his actions, had started to distance himself from Margaret more and more. But Margaret, still consumed by her need for Ethan's affection, couldn't let go of the relationship. Unbeknownst to her, however, a storm was quietly brewing in the background, one that would shatter the fragile world she had built. It all started when Sarah, Ethan's girlfriend, became suspicious. Over the past few months, she had noticed strange behaviors in Ethan late nights, distant conversations, and unexplained absences. Her gut told her something wasn't right, and after finding out that Ethan had been evasive and uncharacteristically cold toward her, she decided to take matters into her own hands. Sarah's suspicions led her to reach out to someone who could help her get to the bottom of the mystery, an anonymous tip to Charles Wilson. Tip was simple but devastating. Margaret Wilson, Charles' wife, was having an affair with Ethan, Charles' own brother. The revelation struck Charles hard, and though he initially dismissed it as an attempt to sow discord, the seed of doubt had been planted. He began to notice more signs of Margaret's strange behavior, her distracted demeanor, and the ongoing changes in her appearance. It was as though his wife had become a stranger, someone he no longer recognized. The more he thought about it, the more Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He decided to take action, even if it meant betraying his wife's trust. Late one evening, when Margaret was out shopping, Charles installed hidden cameras in the most intimate spaces of their home places where he knew Margaret and Ethan often spent time together. He told himself it was for peace of mind, that he just needed to be sure. Over the following weeks, Charles checked the footage regularly, growing increasingly frustrated by what he saw nothing incriminating. But on one particular evening, just as the leaves outside began to turn to gold, Charles finally discovered the truth. In one of the clips, the footage revealed Margaret and Ethan in the living room, laughing and exchanging glances. At first, it appeared harmless, even innocent. But as the video continued, it became clear that their relationship was far from innocent. There, in the quiet privacy of their home, Ethan was holding Margaret's hand, their bodies pressed together as they shared a passionate kiss. Charles' heart sank as he watched them, the footage revealing their affair in full, unashamed detail. The shock of it all hit Charles like a wave crashing onto the shore. The anger bubbled up inside him, followed by a profound sense of humiliation. He could hardly believe what he was seeing, but there was no denying the evidence before him. His wife, the woman he had been married to for over a decade, had betrayed him in the most intimate and devastating way possible with his own brother. Furious and heartbroken, Charles wasted no time confronting Margaret. He waited until the evening when she returned home, expecting the usual, quiet, uneventful evening. As Margaret walked through the door, he greeted her with an icy silence that sent a shiver down her spine. "Margaret," Charles said coldly, his voice trembling with anger. "We need to talk." Margaret, sensing the tension, immediately became defensive. "What is it now, Charles?" she asked, feigning a calm she didn't feel. Charles didn't waste any time. He pulled out his phone and played the footage for her, the footage that had turned his entire world upside down. As the video of Margaret and Ethan unfolded before her eyes, Margaret's face turned pale, her heart racing. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. This isn't what it looks like." But Charles didn't let her deny it. "You lied to me, Margaret. You've been lying to me this entire time." "With my brother? How could you do this to me?" His voice cracked as he struggled to contain his emotions. Margaret's eyes welled up with tears, and she broke down. "I'm sorry, Charles. I never meant for this to happen. It just did." Her voice trembled with guilt, but there was a sense of desperation in her tone, as though she was looking for an escape from the truth. Charles, unable to control his fury, slammed his fist against the table. "You've destroyed everything, Margaret. Our marriage, our family. And for what? Some cheap affair with Ethan?" His voice was laced with both hurt and rage. "How long has this been going on?" Margaret, still crying, couldn't look him in the eye. I don't know. I was lonely, Charles. You were never there for me. You've been so distant, so cold. I needed someone who cared about me." The words stung, each one a sharp reminder of the cracks in their marriage that Charles had long ignored. Margaret's accusations were not entirely unfounded. Charles knew deep down that his emotional neglect had contributed to the distance between them. But it didn't make the betrayal any less painful. "You've humiliated me," Charles spat, his anger flaring. "And you think you can justify it because I was distant. That's not an excuse, Margaret." Margaret wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself, but her voice remained broken. "I didn't want it to happen like this. I didn't mean to hurt you. But, Ethan, he was there for me when you weren't. I didn't ask for this. Charles couldn't listen to any more. His heart was shattering as he realized how deep the betrayal went. He had always thought their marriage was built on love, on trust, but now he saw it for what it truly was, a fragile illusion. "You're right about one thing, Margaret," Charles said, his voice low and cold. "You didn't ask for this, but you're going to regret it." As the night wore on, the argument between them intensified, with Charles accusing Margaret of everything from emotional abandonment to the destruction of their family. Margaret, on the other hand, was consumed by guilt and regret, but also by a twisted sense of justification. She blamed Charles for not being there when she needed him the most, for allowing her to feel invisible and unimportant. The confrontation left both of them raw, their emotions laid bare in the harsh light of truth. But for Margaret, it was just the beginning. The fragile, secret world she had built with Ethan was beginning to unravel, and the consequences of her actions were now unavoidable. By the winter of 2023, everything in the Wilson household was falling apart. The anger Charles felt toward Ethan and Margaret had been building for weeks. When Charles discovered the affair, he couldn't let it go. His thoughts were consumed with betrayal, and he was determined to confront Ethan once and for all. Charles spent days thinking about the right moment to confront Ethan. He wanted answers, wanted to hear Ethan admit what he had done to destroy his family. Finally, he decided to invite Ethan over under the excuse of needing to talk about family matters. Margaret was uneasy about it, but Charles insisted, so Ethan reluctantly agreed to come. The meeting took place on a cold winter afternoon, with snow falling outside. Ethan arrived, unaware of what Charles was planning. He had been dreading this moment, but hoped that perhaps they could work things out. Unfortunately, he didn't know how angry Charles really was. Charles greeted Ethan with a forced smile, masking the rage inside. "Glad you could make it," Charles said coldly. "We need to talk." As they sat down at the table, the tension in the room was palpable. Charles didn't waste any time. "I know about you and Margaret," he said, his voice low and furious. "You've been having an affair behind my back. You think I don't know? You've betrayed me." Ethan tried to explain himself, his voice shaking with guilt. "Charles, I never meant for this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you." But Charles wasn't listening. His anger took over, and he began accusing Ethan of everything, of being a liar, a coward, and a traitor. "You're a disgrace," Charles spat. "You've ruined my life, my marriage. I trusted you, and you stabbed me in the back." Ethan, feeling overwhelmed with shame, stood up, his voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt you, Charles. I'm sorry for everything." But Charles wasn't going to let Ethan off the hook. "Sorry doesn't fix this," he yelled. "You've destroyed everything." Just then, Margaret, who had been standing nearby, stepped into the room. She could hear the argument escalating and was terrified of what would happen next. "Charles, please," she begged. "Stop this. This isn't helping anything." But Charles ignored her. His anger had reached its peak, and he lashed out. "Stay out of this, Margaret," he shouted. "This is between me and him." The argument turned into a physical confrontation. Charles, his face red with rage, pushed Ethan hard. Ethan stumbled back, and before anyone could stop it, the situation spiraled out of control. Charles grabbed Ethan by the collar, shaking him violently. Margaret rushed over, trying to pull Charles away, but in her panic, she made the situation worse. In the chaos, Charles shoved Ethan again. Ethan lost his balance and hit his head hard on the edge of the table, causing him to collapse to the floor. Margaret screamed in horror. "Ethan, no," she cried, rushing to his side. But it was too late. Ethan wasn't moving. Charles stood frozen, his chest heaving with breath. He stared at his brother's motionless body, the reality of what he had just done sinking in. He had lost control in a fit of rage, and now Ethan was dead. The room was filled with silence, except for Margaret's sobs. Charles looked down at his brother and whispered. But there was no going back. The violence, the anger, it had all led to this tragic moment. Ethan was gone, and nothing could undo the damage that had been done. The family's life would never be the same. What had started as an affair between Margaret and Ethan had ended in violence and death. And the weight of it all would haunt Charles and Margaret forever. After Ethan's death, Charles was filled with panic. He knew they couldn't let anyone find out about what had happened. He needed to cover up the crime, no matter the cost. In his fear, he turned to Margaret, knowing she would help him, whether she wanted to or not. "We have to hide this, Margaret," Charles said, his voice shaky with fear. "We can't let anyone find out about Ethan. If they do, everything will be over." Margaret, still in shock, could barely understand what was happening. The reality of Ethan's death was too much for her to process. But Charles didn't give her time to think. He was desperate to cover his tracks. "We'll bury him," Charles said, his eyes wide with urgency. "We'll bury his body somewhere. No one will find it. We'll say he ran away. No one will know." Margaret was too scared to argue. "Where should we bury him?" she whispered, barely able to speak. Charles already had a plan. "There's a wooded area outside of town. No one goes there. It's perfect." That night, under the cover of darkness, they drove out to the woods. They dug a shallow grave and carefully buried Ethan's body, trying to hide the evidence of their crime. The night was cold and still, and as they worked, the reality of what they were doing hit Margaret hard. She had just helped bury her brother-in-law's body, and now she was part of a horrible secret. Once they finished, Charles tried to reassure her. "It's over. We'll say he just left. He was always troubled. No one will question it." But as the days passed, Margaret's guilt started to eat away at her. Every day felt like a nightmare. She couldn't stop thinking about Ethan and the way his body had looked when they buried him. She felt sick with guilt and became paranoid. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop thinking about what they had done. Charles, on the other hand, seemed to put the whole thing out of his mind. He went on with his life, going to work and acting like everything was fine. But Margaret couldn't do that. The guilt was overwhelming her, and she started to lose her grip on reality. She became increasingly anxious and distant, jumping at every noise and avoiding people as much as she could. Meanwhile, Ethan's girlfriend, Rachel, was starting to get worried. She hadn't heard from Ethan in days, and that wasn't like him. At first, she thought he might just need some space, but as time went on, she became more concerned. Eventually, she filed a missing persons report, hoping someone would find him. The police began investigating. They looked into Ethan's last known whereabouts and talked to people who might know where he had gone. For a while, the case didn't go anywhere. But then, a neighbor came forward, saying they had seen Charles and Margaret leaving their house in the middle of the night around the time Ethan had disappeared. This was enough to raise suspicion, so the police started focusing on the Wilsons. The detectives also found small signs that something wasn't right: tire tracks near the wooded area and signs of digging where someone had recently buried something. It became clear that the Wilsons had been out there, trying to cover up their crime. The police started to piece everything together. They began to connect the dots: the suspicious trips to the woods, the neighbor's report, and the unusual behavior of Charles and Margaret. They were getting closer to the truth. As the investigation progressed, Margaret's behavior grew even more erratic. The guilt was eating her alive, and she couldn't hide it anymore. Slowly but surely, the police were getting closer to discovering what really happened to Ethan. As the investigation continued, the police were getting closer to the truth. Margaret could feel the pressure building up. The guilt she'd been carrying for months was too much to bear, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything came out. One day, the police brought Margaret in for more questioning. She was exhausted and emotionally drained. The detectives were calm but persistent, and they knew how to make her feel trapped. "Margaret," one of the detectives said gently, "we already know what happened. You can help yourself by telling us the truth. We can make things easier for you." Margaret sat there, her hands shaking. For a moment, she thought about staying quiet, but the guilt and fear overwhelmed her. She finally broke down and confessed everything. She told the police how the affair with Ethan had started, how it had grown more serious, and how things had spiraled out of control. She admitted that Charles had killed Ethan in a fit of rage, and how they had both buried his body in the woods to cover up the crime. Margaret's voice cracked as she spoke, and she cried as she admitted that she had been scared and didn't know what to do. "I never wanted this to happen," she sobbed. "Charles, he made me help him. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I swear I didn't." The police were stunned, but they now had all the information they needed. Margaret's confession was the final piece of the puzzle. Shortly after, Margaret was arrested. The media quickly picked up the story, and it became a huge sensation. News outlets shared the shocking details about the affair, the murder, and the family's attempt to cover it all up. People couldn't believe what had happened within the Wilson family. As the trial began, the public was glued to the courtroom drama. The prosecution focused on the violence of the crime and how the affair had destroyed the family. The defense argued that Margaret had been manipulated by her husband and acted out of fear. In the end, Margaret's decision to confess helped her receive a lighter sentence. The judge took into account her cooperation with the authorities, and her sentence was reduced. Margaret was given a much shorter prison term for her involvement in the crime. Charles, however, wasn't as lucky. Even though his defense tried to argue that he had acted out of anger, the jury convicted him of second-degree murder. The evidence was clear that he had killed Ethan, and he was sentenced to many years in prison. When the verdicts were read, Margaret sat in the courtroom, tears in her eyes. She knew her life would never be the same. Her marriage was over, and the betrayal of her family had cost her everything. Charles, now facing a long prison sentence, didn't even look at her. Their relationship was shattered beyond repair. Margaret's life was forever changed. Although her punishment was lighter, she would always live with the guilt of what happened. Charles, now locked away for his crime, would spend the rest of his life paying for what he had done. The tragic story of the Wilson family became a warning to others, showing how lies and betrayal can destroy everything in their path.